Welcome to the latest edition of the First Thursday Club. As you can see, we're going to be talking about dormice today. My name is John Davies. I'm a director at RSK Biosensors, and I also lead the RSK Wilding Biodiversity Net Gain team. I also have a bit of experience with dormice on development sites. I'm particularly interested in this talk today from Tim Clark. I will introduce you properly in a minute, Tim, but if you can go on to the first slide, I will go through the normal housekeeping rules for everyone. Okay, so most of you know the drill here. We have your microphones are switched off, but we're obviously very keen to hear from you. If you have any questions, pop them into the Q&A part of the dashboard on your right. I'll sift through those during the talk and put those to Tim at the end. We will probably be a bit pressed for time today. There's a lot to get through. If we don't get to answer all the questions, Tim has very kindly agreed to respond to those offline by email. So don't worry if we don't get to your question, we will answer it. There will be a feedback form coming to you about an hour after the webinar, so do please fill that in with suggestions for what talks you might want to hear in 2026. We've got an awful lot of experts here covering all aspects of ecology, so if you've got any ideas, do pop them into that form. Right, Tim, if you can go on to the next slide, I'll quickly introduce you. So Tim Clark is a associate director at RSK Biosensors. He's been an ecological consultant for 15 years. A lot of the work he does is on dormice, surveys, assessment, mitigation, for a wide variety of different development projects, from housing to roads to rail, every kind of scenario you can think of. Outside of work, also he's involved with the Dormouse, the National Dormouse Monitoring Programme. So he's been doing that for about 12 years across a number of sites in Somerset. So he's very much the person to talk to us about dormice. He is Mr. Dormouse. I'm going to call him Mr. Dormouse now, just to embarrass you. Anyway, so he is the ideal person. I will just pass over to you now, Tim. Take it away. Turn your camera off. I'll do the same, and take it away.
Okay, thanks, John. So today we're going to be considering dormice on development projects. So we'll start with the what and the why. So what is a dormouse? Well, in the UK we have one species of native dormouse, Muscardinus ablanarius. If you've not seen one before, there's a picture on the right-hand side. It's a small golden furred mouse. Large furry ears, black eyes, and a furry tail. Its scientific name roughly translates as mouse of the hazel trees. So globally, Muscardinus ablanarius is present throughout Europe, from Italy and Turkey in the south up to south of Sweden and across to Russia in the east. British Isles are on the western extent of its range, and within the British Isles, historically, we believe it's always been absent from Scotland and Ireland, and has historically been present throughout most of Wales, most of England, with possible exceptions of Anglesey and Norfolk. The current range. So in the last sort of 150 years, there's been a significant decline in the range of the species across England and Wales. Approximately 17 counties where it's now extinct, where it was previously present, and a number of others where it's only present due to reintroduction efforts, which have either reintroduced populations or are bolstering remnant populations that are on the edge. So it's a species that's fairly well studied, certainly in terms of numbers and monitoring. So National Dormouse Monitoring Programme has been running for over 30 years. Monthly checks across woodlands in England and Wales, led by volunteers. And over that time, certainly between 2000 and 2022, it's estimated that there's been a 70% decline in the population. Because of this, whilst it's globally listed as least concern on the IUCN database, within Great Britain, and that refers to England and Wales, it's vulnerable to extinction, and arguably could be upgraded to endangered. So in order to understand and assess impacts on dormice, we need to understand a little bit about their ecology. So just going to do a very brief overview. So their ecology, their active season, there are species that hibernate, and so they start to awaken in sort of March. This is a phased process. So generally they will start to awaken for short periods of time, but will return to hibernation if the weather worsens or there's not enough food around. And over a period of several weeks, they will become more active. They will still enter periods of torpor, even once fully active in kind of April and May. Torpor is a mini form of hibernation that can last several hours to several days. And it's effectively a deep sleep, but also allows them to conserve energy for when resources are bad or not available. So particularly in April and May, they will go into torpor during mornings when it's cooler. From May onwards, so between May and October, they can give birth. The majority of births take place, or litters take place, between August and September, when we get around 2/3 of our dormouse litters. But depending on the year, they can breed any time between May and October. And it's not that unusual to have an early brood. Certainly this year, anecdotally, there seems to have been quite a lot of early broods in May, and potential for second broods towards the end of the season in September, October. From that point onwards, they are considering hibernation, so they are foraging, looking to fatten up, looking for high fat food resources, which can be hazel where it's present, in their territories. And then from sort of end of October onwards, they're going back into hibernation. This is kind of led by longer and longer periods of torpor, and eventually go into hibernation. So unit life in pictures. So generally they hibernate at ground level. So that's top left picture. You've got a woven grass nest in some leaf litter. Hibernation nests can be away from cover, so they're often, or have been found, in some unusual locations. I found them in railway ballasts. They've been found in moss over concrete, grass fields, and bracken. So during this time, they can be found in non-typical locations. During the summer, they're building or weaving. Stereotypical nests are grass and stripped bark, often with leaves present, but they will often use what's available to them. So sort of the bottom right, you've got a nest that's been made within an old wren's nest. And then during the summer, you've got the breeding period. In terms of habitats, the main things they need from the habitats are good cover, food resource throughout the year, so a diversity of plant species, nesting sites, and suitable hibernation locations. So the stereotypical dormouse habitat is woodland, often with a fairly dense understory. However, they are found in a myriad of locations, including scrub. So we've got bramble scrub in the top left, and mixed scrub. They are found in hedgerows, both managed and unmanaged, and also in woodlands such as high canopy woodlands with no or limited understory, and also coniferous woodlands. So they have been found in forestry plantations. Where you've got these sort of optimal habitats, you can also then have use of adjacent habitats that may not be considered optimal or standard. So they have been found in bracken, in reed beds, on grassland, and potentially, particularly during the hibernation periods, they may look to utilize these habitats. So when we're considering dormice in the landscape, or dormice on development, it's useful to look at it from a landscape perspective. This is to the west of Bristol, and we've got a number of parcels of woodland with interconnected by hedgerows. We've also got areas of scrub or managed landscapes. We've got a railway in the south of the picture, and all of these can, and in many cases are, used by dormice. In this kind of landscape, it's important to consider not just the optimal habitats which stand out, such as the woodlands, but also those that may not be used by them all year but could connect them. So where you've got parcels of woodlands connected by, let's call them suboptimal or low quality, poor quality habitats such as hedgerows that are maybe single species or gappy, they may still form part of a dormouse's habitat and functional habitat, but may not be used all year round. So considering survey and assessment, so what information do you need to inform impact assessment for a development and to decide whether you need surveys? Well, generally we start with a desk study. So are there existing records nearby? It's also useful to do a landscape assessment of your site. So how does your site sit into the local landscape? What features are nearby that could be used by dormice? Even if there's no records, obviously absence of a record doesn't suggest absence of the species. One of the things that, so for this section onwards, I'm largely inferring and referring to the latest guidance which came out in 2025, which is the Hazel Dormouse Mitigation Handbook and also the Hazel Dormouse Conservation Handbook. One of the things that has been stated in the Mitigation Handbook in the latest issue is that records less than 5 years old from within the site boundary or up to 3 kilometres away, noting that many desk studies are to 2 kilometres, where habitat is connected and has not significantly changed, may be used to infer presence on a site. Now, I've done this before on sites where I've used desk study data to infer likely presence on site. I would just urge a note of caution when doing this, both for planning applications and consideration of licensing requirements at a later date, or if you don't require planning or permissions, then for your project. Both Natural England and Natural Resources Wales suggest that they want data within 3 years, preferably from the last survey season, to inform a license. And if you were to use this approach, I definitely encourage early stakeholder engagement, but it is an option. The other thing we're going to need to determine what kind of survey we need, and if we need a survey, is the habitat quality assessment. And we'll talk about that a bit more on the next slide. And finally, and this is something that sometimes gets missed, is considering the likely impacts early. Do you need a survey? If you are not likely to commit an offence under the legislation, then do you actually need to know whether dormice are present on your site? So the habitat quality assessment is something that's been included in the latest mitigation guidance. Prior to this, assessment of habitat quality was quite subjective and was down to individual surveyors. I know that certain companies had their own strategies for doing this. And also one of the things we used to see a lot was marking down a habitat's potential if hazel was absent. If you take one thing away from this presentation, I would suggest that it be that absence of hazel doesn't mean that dormice are absent. There are plenty of examples of habitats where hazel is either absent or in very, very low quantities, but they're still present. One of the key things for dormouse survival is diversity of plant species to provide that year-round resource. And I think the HQA does a better job of kind of trying to track that and make use of that. So a HQA requires a site visit, and we're going to use it to inform whether a presence or likely absence survey is needed. and we're going to use to inform the best survey method. And if we find dormice, it's going to inform the impact assessment. There's a number of survey methods available. Prior to the latest guidance, the main survey methods being used were nest tubes, intermingled with nest boxes. Footprint tunnels have started to be used a bit more as standard for the last couple of years. But since this guidance come out, it's now an approved method. You'll see that there are, I think there's 9 methods mentioned in the mitigation guidance, of which only 3 of them can infer likely absence if you don't find dormice. So for the majority of this presentation, I'll be talking about those 3 specifically, but don't forget about the others. They can be very useful, particularly in sites where you've got limitations to your surveys, or potentially where you need to try and confirm presence very quickly. Use of multiple surveys can be really important. Once you've confirmed presence using any method, you can stop. So that's something to consider. If you've got a project on a tight deadline, potentially multiple methods could be useful. And my kind of assumption is that acoustic ID will become a lot more prevalent in sort of the next 5 years. We use BTO acoustic pipeline for some of our BATs data analysis, and that will tell you if it's recorded small mammals or it thinks it's auto-identified small mammals in your BAT data, including dormice. We've had some erroneous results, but we've also had positive results from that. And I can see in the next few years, if we can gather the data and set some parameters for its use, then acoustic ID could become a really important survey method. So focusing on the main three that can show presence or likely absence. I'm not going to talk through this slide in full. These slides will go on to the First Thursday Club website. So if you want to come back and look at it in detail, please feel free. Couple of things, I guess, to just be aware of is that your HQA results and the timing, excuse me, seasonal timing will be a big decider on what method you use. For nest tubes, you can now potentially do 3 months from July to September. My experience is that in general, you tend to get dormice towards the end of the season, potentially September, October. Excuse me. But there are more options now for surveys, which is good. So when considering which method to use, first of all, you do need your habitat quality assessment, and you need to understand what proportion of your site habitats fall into the excellent, good, or fair, poor categories. You want to know whether hazel is present. If you don't have hazel or don't have sufficient quantity of it, then undertaking a nut search, which is one of the 3 options, isn't going to be feasible or is going to be very difficult. I also wouldn't underestimate, so nut searches can be incredibly useful. If you find evidence of dormice using a nut search, then potentially you don't need to do anything further in terms of survey work, and it can also be done during the winter, which the majority of methods can't, at least not if you're going to use it to show likely absence. But I would just caution that it's actually really difficult to find 100 hazelnuts opened by small mammals, excluding squirrels and excluding food caches on most sites, particularly small development projects or small development sites. It could be really difficult to actually use that method. So do consider, don't rule it out, but do consider whether it's appropriate. Other considerations are how often you can access the site. Footprint tunnels require 2 visits a month. And for sites that are potentially open to the public, do consider whether nest tubes are appropriate or boxes, because if they are likely to be disturbed more by interested members of the public, one, you've got the risk of animals using them being disturbed, but equally animals may not use them if they're disturbed regularly, which could affect your results. When it comes to particularly smaller sites or complex sites where potentially using a full survey method on its own may be difficult, do consider whether doing the minimum survey effort, which could be 3 months in some of these cases, is actually efficient to manage the risk to your project or to your client. Previously we used to do a full season's worth of surveys using nest tubes. The new mitigation guidelines allow you to do a number of methods, some of which are much quicker, which is positive, but do just consider whether ultimately doing the minimum on your project, on your site, is sufficient to manage the risk, because ultimately we need to relate this back to the potential offences under the legislation, and that's the driver behind much of this is managing risk. I'm not going to talk in any great detail about this, but I did just want to flag to people that if you don't find dormice during your presence absence surveys, that's not the end of your assessment. Refer to the mitigation guidance, pages 9 and 23, to take it further, and do consider whether that landscape scale use by dormice, if you've got a suboptimal hedge, a poor quality hedge, single species, unlikely to support dormice all year round, but potentially could be used for dispersal, particularly spring or autumn, is footprint tunnels alone in May and July going to cover off all uses. For when you do identify dormice being present on your site, it's then necessary to try and estimate density. Again, Mitigation Handbook now has a density table. It assumes that all sites have nice round numbers like kilometres of hedgerow and hectares of woodland, which for the vast majority of sites will not be the case. These example tables are my interpretation of how it could be displayed. I'm not suggesting they're correct, but it's just one example. It gives an idea of how to sensibly determine numbers. It is worth just being aware of for assessment and potentially licensing purposes that these numbers, I believe, are adults in the spring when the population is lowest, just after hibernation. So if you were licensing, some of these numbers may be slightly low. If you were to do it in the autumn when you've got juveniles and young of the year around as well. So when doing impact assessment, I mean, the main driver other than conservation is really consideration of offences under the legislation. Some of these aren't specifically referenced in the legislation, so for instance habitat fragmentation or predation, but they are covered by the legislation in terms of its interpretation. Consider whether your impacts will be temporary or permanent, and do follow the mitigation hierarchy. Some impacts can be designed out very early on in the scheme, and that can be helpful, particularly well, it can be helpful to avoid redesigns if you do find dormice. I get asked a lot, what's the minimum amount of vegetation we can clear without a license? And there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to that. I've taken this sentence from out of, I think it's the Mitigation Handbook, which says that if you're impacting more than a small proportion of an individual's home range, then potentially you could do non-licensed works using a precautionary working method statement. That would be down to both the ecologist and the client to justify and agree a decision in relation to the possible offences that could be caused and provide a defence to that in case of challenge. You could use the density table in the following slide from the mitigation handbook to try and determine what a small proportion of an individual home range is likely to be within the type of habitat you've got and the type of habitat quality. But yeah, there is no one size fits all when it comes to that. So just looking at some of the impacts that can occur on development projects, whether it's something that's been through planning or maintenance of infrastructure. So retain as much habitat as possible. And for temporary clearance, if you can, try and retain root structures, because it will allow for faster regeneration. Consider the ecological functionality of adjacent habitats, and that's really to think about if you've got, again, suboptimal habitats or poor quality habitats, how they may still be part of the Dormouse's life cycle and functionality. Avoid creating gaps over 10 meters. Dormice can travel along the ground. They're primarily an arboreal species, so they will generally stay up in vegetation if they can, and that is their preference. But research has shown that they will, in extreme circumstances, travel several hundred meters along the ground. They have been found in central reservations of dual carriageways, which means they must have crossed at least 20 to 30 meters of road. However, these seem to be, this doesn't seem to be the norm, and certainly we shouldn't be assuming that by creating new gaps, they will just cross them. It does increase their risk of predation, and there's also other obstacles to them using a gap. So avoid using them wherever possible. When considering degradation, the most obvious one for this would be a agricultural field where the hedgerow is cut once a year in autumn, and then once it's a residential development for aesthetics, it's cut 3 or 4 times a year. Not just are you going to change the structure of that hedgerow, but you could actually be removing food resources at key times. So if you cut when things are in flower, if you cut when berries should be on the tree, you're removing potential food resources, and therefore you may actually be affecting the functionality of that hedge to support a dormouse population. So when we're mitigating or considering mitigation on development sites or infrastructure, there's a number of options. We can translocate existing habitats, we can create new habitats, and where we are doing that, generally we aim for 2:1 ratio. So for every 1 meter removed, you put 2 meters back. There is some wiggle room on that. It depends on what you're doing exactly and whether it's permanent, but 2:1 is a rough guide. I put bramble can be your friend, and the reason I put that is because I've worked on a few projects where we design these lovely planting schemes, and we plant hazel saplings and a mixed scrub or a mixed woodland saplings, and then as part of the management plan, if it's followed out, contractors will go in and clear anything around them to try and stop them being overwhelmed. And often one of the things they're clearing out is bramble, which is one of the first things to come back. Bramble is a really important plant for dormice. It provides food resource quite a lot of the year. So they've got pollen and flowers in the spring, summer, and then berries in end of summer, autumn. So it's also very quick to establish. So if you need quick ground cover, bramble can be your friend. And if you are doing any kind of habitat creation, you have to care for it, because otherwise it's not enough just to plant it, because otherwise it's just going to die off. And if you're at this stage, you're probably working under a license, and therefore you're going to fail your conditions. On many sites, improving existing habitats is an easy win. You can improve the diversity of a hedgerow or a piece of scrub or a woodland, plant it more densely to get that best cover, and look at connectivity. And when you're considering management plans for any form of created or retained hedgerow, be pragmatic. Ultimately, many of these habitats will be managed by contractors, so suggesting that a hedgerow in a residential development will be laid using traditional techniques every 10 years just isn't very realistic. Ultimately, there will be occasions when you have to remove dormouse habitat. I should say that if you've got to this point, the assumption is that you are working under a license, either from Natural England or Natural Resources Wales, where you have to do timing of vegetation clearance, timing of works will apply. Generally, there's a daily limit on the amount of vegetation you're allowed to clear, which can be 150 meters linear or 0.25 hectares. That can be negotiated on some projects depending on what kind of habitat you've got, but that's fairly standard. Where you are doing a two-stage cut, which is where you clear some vegetation in the winter above ground, but leave the root stalls, and then come back in the spring, the idea being that any hibernating dormice will be at ground level during the winter, and then will wake up and then run towards the nearest habitat. Just plan and bear in mind that particularly for big areas, getting machinery in can be really difficult because it's quite difficult to check the ground, because that's where the dormice will be hibernating. Where you've got single stage clearance in the spring, you almost always come across nesting birds to be factored in. If you come across any animals during vegetation clearance, you're going to have to translocate them somewhere. And ecologists for any of this kind of works would be required to do fingertip searches. It takes time. I've had projects where 2 ecologists have turned up and 30 people with strimmers and chainsaws, and we've had to stand the majority of them down because it's just not practical or feasible to check that much habitat that quickly. Similarly, if the client wants to use a flail or something like that, that needs to be planned really carefully because it takes time, and you could spend all day checking the amount of vegetation that a tractor and flail will clear in 15 minutes. And it requires planning to get it right. So disturbance, noise, light, vibration. There is limited research on either of these aspects, and these are largely driven by legislative requirements to avoid disturbing dormice. So there's no actual threshold to what constitute disturbance in terms of noise levels or light levels or vibration. From the habitats regulations, so the conservation of habitats and species regulations, the kind of guidance is disturbance is anything that will affect their ability to survive, breed, or hibernate. However, they're also covered for disturbance under the Wildlife Countryside Act, and there's no minimum threshold set. So this is something where an element of common sense is needed, as well as more research. But generally, we want to limit impacts of lighting. They are nocturnal. And where we've got vibration and noise, either during construction or potentially post-construction, depending on what the project is, consider how that's going to affect them at different times of their life cycle, particularly during breeding and hibernation, which are both listed under habitats regs as disturbance impacts, and consider timing, duration, and distance. You can use acoustic barriers, and I've also used ground matting to try and limit vibration. Again, there's not a huge amount of research out there on that, so it's sort of a common sense approach in some cases. And the last impact I'm going to touch on today is predation. This is primarily for residential developments. Obviously, cat ownership and dog ownership, but cat ownership is relatively high in the population. So if you build a new residential development, you will increase the number of domestic cats. Covenants and education packs on properties do not work, and they're not enforceable over the long term. And so the best defense to that is basically allowing enough habitat that dormice can go about their business without being or without significant risk of predation. So we want to limit number of gaps in the habitats around the site, because the more gaps they have to cross, if they cross them, is going to expose them to predation. And then the habitats, we want to try and make them tall, thorny, and dense to allow dormice to basically forage and commute without being caught so easily, and avoid light spill, because it does potentially increase cat success. You can use things like fencing, and in some situations even installing like a watercourse or a ditch to try and prevent cats. I don't think they're fully effective, but it can go some way to dissuading them from getting to the habitats where the dormice are. So if you've got to this point, then presumably you've done these works under a license, you've assessed it, you've done the works under the license, and then you're now in the process of monitoring what you've done. Normally, we'll be asked to monitor by installing nest boxes to monitor the population over time. There may also be a requirement to monitor habitats that are either created or enhanced. I've said there that you could potentially use the habitat quality assessment as a marker for that, but there are other options. Habitats in particular can require frequent checks, particularly at the start. First 3 years are quite crucial for actually establishing new habitats, and that comes back to the whole care of once you've planted them. They do need caring to make sure they survive. Where you've got brand new habitats, we may need to prove presence or prove use of them. So you'll be doing some form of survey beyond just a nest box. For infrastructure projects or any project where you've got to install a bridge or a crossing point, which I've not really touched on purely because of time, and they don't often get used in residential projects. But if you are using something like that to try and limit fragmentation and create connectivity, you may have to monitor use of that as well. For most residential projects or small scale projects, you're probably looking at 3 to 5 years worth of monitoring on most licenses. And then it can go up from there. So the largest schemes, 25 years. For projects that create a reasonable amount of habitat, 10 years isn't unheard of. So don't underestimate the monitoring requirements. And finally, I've kind of mentioned it a little bit as I've gone through, but there's a lot of evidence gaps at the moment with dormice. Whilst we've monitored them for a long time, there's still a lot of things we don't know with how they'd react to habitat manipulation or disturbance, noise, things like that. So if you do work with dormice, do share your successes and failures. It just helps with the evidence base. Thank you. So that was Dormouse in a nutshell. Very quick run through. Any questions?
That's a very bad joke. Did you pop your camera back on?
Yeah.
Tim, thank you. Brilliant. Good stuff. Very comprehensive, very thorough. We do have some questions. We've got about 5 minutes. We might go over a little bit. But as I said, you will be happy to respond to people if we don't get through all the questions. Let's start with a couple of related ones. So do you need to be licensed to do the habitat quality assessment, and do you need to be licensed to do the precautionary working method statement?
So no, you don't need to be licensed to do either of those things. You don't need to be licensed for the habitat quality assessment, because there's a set standard within the mitigation guidelines. I would say you don't need to be licensed for the precautionary working method statement. However, I do think you need someone with Dormouse experience in order to determine whether it's an appropriate method, because ultimately you're going to rely on that. You know, if it were to go wrong, that's your legal defense. So you're saying that we've fully considered this and we think that we're not going to cause an offence under the legislation by doing these works, and here's our document basically evidencing that. And you need to be pretty sure that you're that's watertight. So technically, no, it doesn't need to be someone licensed, but I would make sure that it's someone who knows what they're talking about when it comes to dormice, because you don't want to have to rely on it and find that it's pulled apart.
Sure. So yeah, expertise is important. All right. Right, quite a few questions coming in now. So when doing an HQA on a woodland parcel, I think you answered this in the call actually, in the webinar, that is not 1 hectare, but is half a hectare. The guidance shows the number of dormice per hectare. So I think you just halved it if it was half a hectare.
I think I just halved it. Yeah, I think I just halved it. I will say that's this is my interpretation of this. So it could be wrong, but I think it's a pragmatic
it's justifiable, yeah, and you always bear in mind if it goes to public inquiry, you'll have to justify it and you know, argue the toss over it. So you need to be comfortable that you've made a reasonable assertion.
Yeah, that's it. I think as long as you can justify it and say how you've come to that conclusion.
Right, the new guidance seems to suggest that any site in the south of England needs surveys, because even if you don't find any during the surveys, you still need to consider if they could be there. Can you rule out surveys during a PA?
Yeah, I definitely, I don't think the process has changed in that respect. I think the HQA provides a more consistent approach to habitat assessment, but that's it. Like, you can still, if the habitat isn't suitable, there are areas where dormice aren't particularly common in south of England, or widespread. They seem to be limited to certain woodlands. So yeah, absolutely, you can, and also, like I said, do consider your actual impacts. I've been asked to do dormouse surveys in the past, and when we've actually chatted to the client about what they're doing, it's clear they don't need them. Even if dormice are present, they're not going to commit an offence, and so we went straight down the precautionary working method statement route. So you can do that as well. So no, I don't think every site does need a dormouse assessment, to be honest, or a survey. I don't think it's changed in that respect.
Okay. Right, I've seen consultant reports where they cite dormice rarely go further than 70 metres from their nest site as justification for no mitigation requirement. What's the latest understanding of dormouse home range? We've had another question, what's the typical territory size? So I guess those two are related.
Okay, so there is some, there's a bit of a range basically in terms of the dormouse range. I think the latest is broadly 0.5 hectares of woodland or scrub. I think it's 185 meters. I need to double check that, but it's more than 70 meters for a territory size at the moment. And also we have, there is research of animals traveling hundreds of meters between woodland parcels, or I think there was some research in Italy that had dormice traveling nearly 1 kilometre through agricultural fields to get to the next next parcel of woodland. So whilst that's probably not the norm by any means, I don't think 70 meters is enough to say that there's no. Yeah.
I mean, any rule of thumb like that, you know, you've got to back it up with some sort of justification, as I said earlier.
Yeah.
You know, you're always think about this as this could go to inquiry and you might be grilled on it. You know, so you need a proper ecological justification for why you make any assertions like that. It's, you know, it is the case that there's no hard and fast rule for many of these things. So you need to, you know, you will be a specialist and expert, but you'll need to back it up with some sort of logic or evidence.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, yeah, go on.
Yeah, sorry, go on. I was going to say I would use the I'd now use the estimated density tables and mitigation guidance backed up with range sizes from a number of different research articles, because they do vary depending on and there hasn't been enough to say, you know, in this habitat type, in this area of the country, these are their home ranges. We know they survive in areas that aren't typical habitat, and their home ranges may be much bigger in those areas because the food resource is more spread out, which could include poor quality or suboptimal hedgerows. So it is quite difficult.
Right, let's have a couple more. We're a little bit over. Do woodland edges need to be HQA'd separately, as they're often more dense and may score differently in structural complexity?
Ooh, good question. I don't know the answer to that. I would say these are only guidelines, so there will be sites where HQA doesn't quite fit your site, or you don't agree with it. So I'd encourage anyone to kind of you know, go with your professional judgment, and if you do deviate, as you would with any other guidelines, just explain your reasoning. Yeah, I mean, it's woodland scrub, isn't it? The HQA is for woodland scrub or hedgerows, so arguably yes, you could still use the same thing. But if you disagree with the HQA based on your professional judgment, or feel like you need to deviate from it, they are only guidelines.
Absolutely, they're guidelines. No, absolutely. Yeah, if there's good reason to, I think you should. Yeah. Look, I'm going to ask one more. There are quite a lot of questions, so you'll be a bit busy following these up, Tim, afterwards. Right, last one. The survey effort for poor to fair habitats is a lot higher than may previously have been done, including the incorporation of footprint tunnels, which need checking twice as often as nest tubes being set out alongside them. Costs and surveyor hours are therefore likely to increase substantially, and pushback from clients is also high. Do you think there is flexibility in the use of footprint tunnels or overall survey design which would be acceptable for a planning application?
So my interpretation of poor or fair quality habitats is you can either do 100, and actually this is backed up by the FAQs from May 2025 from the authors. So you can either do 100 nest tubes plus 30 footprint tunnels, or you just do 50 footprint tunnels 3 months. So the authors have said use of footprint tunnels is not impacted by the HQA score. So if you want to use footprint tunnels for 3 months, any 3 months between May and October, my interpretation of it, and I believe I've read it correctly, because there is a few questions. If you find the Mammal Society FAQs from sometime earlier this year, there's a number of questions that ask that about, can we just do footprint tunnels if it's fair or poor? And they've said yes. So 50 footprint tunnels, 3 months. So don't do 6 and 7 months of both.
Okay, great. I think we are going to have to wrap it up there, Tim. Thank you very much. Just to remind people that you will be getting your feedback form in about an hour's time. Do fill that in if you can. The next First Thursday Club is February, so we're going to take our normal winter hiatus in January because everyone's too hungover to listen to us in early January. We're going to have Alexa Culver from my RSK Wilding team, so the legal counsel in our team. She's going to be presenting a talk called The Planning and Infrastructure Bill, the Final Text and What's Next. And for those of you on LinkedIn, you may well have seen the numerous posts that she's been putting on LinkedIn. Really important, trying to make sure the part 3 of the Planning Infrastructure Bill didn't adversely affect our industry. I don't think it's really worked massively, unfortunately. I think the government has got rather steamrolled it. But do listen into Lex's talk in February. I think pass that on to any of your colleagues, because it's really important for our industry more broadly to understand what is likely to happen now in terms of protected species, in terms of environmental delivery plans, these nature levies, all of this stuff. This is a complete kind of reworking of how we do things as an ecological industry. So do please listen into Lex on February the 5th, I think it is. Okay, Tim, thanks again very much for your time today and for a great presentation. And I'm sure you will be following up these questions over the next few hours. Thanks very much for your time. Everyone have a great Christmas, great New Year, and we'll see you in February.